On a cold night in 1933, a group of Inuit people came upon a derelict cargo ship drifting in the icy waters off the coast of northern Alaska. They decided to explore the abandoned ship to see if they could find anything of value. But almost as soon as they climbed aboard, the winds shifted and a violent storm blew in seemingly from nowhere, trapping them inside. As the Arctic winds raged outside, what once felt like a refuge from the storm turned into a nightmare as the small group huddled in a derelict cabin, listening to the ghostly groans of the ship grinding in the shifting ice. When the storm finally cleared 10 days later, the small group fled. The phantom ship, named the Baychimo, would soon vanish. She would mysteriously reappear numerous times all over the Beaufort Sea for over 30 years. The SS Baychimo was launched in Sweden in 1914. Her original name was Ångermanälven, after the Swedish river. Her first owners were German, and she was used as a trading vessel between Hamburg and Sweden throughout the First World War. She was relatively modest in size, weighing in at just 1,322 tons, with a length of 230 feet. She was powered by a triple expansion engine that could achieve 10 knots. After the war, she was handed over to the British as a war reparation in 1920. She left the Baltic Sea and for the first time was purchased in London by the Hudson Bay Company for £15,000. She was renamed the Baychimo. Her first voyage with the company took place in 1921 in the Eastern Arctic. The next year, she was sent to Siberia with her new captain, Sidney Cornwell. He would remain her captain for the rest of her career. The Baychimo would spend the next 2 years trading furs in Siberia, but political tensions soon led the Hudson Bay Company to withdraw from the area. After 1921, she would begin operating in the Western Arctic, traveling between Vancouver and Hudson Bay Company posts along the Yukon and Northern Territories. She completed 9 voyages carrying cargo and furs. She typically had 32 crew members and would occasionally carry passengers. Every winter, she would travel back to her home port in Ardross in Scotland. She would return to Canada through the Panama Canal, and in 1924, she would also travel through the Suez Canal, successfully circumnavigating the globe. The Baychimo experienced particularly treacherous weather conditions in her 1931 season, frequently finding herself mired in fog and heavy ice throughout the summer. In late September, as she passed the Seahorse Islands near Point Barrow, Alaska, the Baychimo encountered an unexpected blizzard. Her crew was forced to drop anchor to weather out the storm. By October 1st, conditions continued to deteriorate, and the steamship was soon trapped in pack ice. Recognizing the dire situation, the crew abandoned the vessel and traveled half a mile through the ice to the town of Barrow, where they would shelter for 2 days. But when they returned, the stricken vessel had broken free from the ice. It was clear that it would be impossible to safely sail the ship further southwest, and the crew would have to watch over her throughout the winter. The situation grew even worse when on October 8th, the ship once again became mired in ice, this time much more thoroughly than before. On the 15th, the Hudson Bay Company sent an aircraft to retrieve the crew, but Captain Cornwall and 14 of his men refused to leave their ship behind. The company provided them with provisions to last through the winter, and they constructed a crude temporary shelter nearby. They wouldn't dare live aboard. It was impossible to keep the ship heated, and the shifting ice threatened to crush her at any moment. They spent their time performing daily maintenance on the ship, mainly clearing ice from her rudder to prevent any damage. Then on November 24th, a blinding storm struck the area. When it finally cleared, the Baychimo was nowhere to be seen. Captain Cornwall and the crew assumed the powerful storm had overtaken the ship, finally breaking her up and sending her to the bottom. But to their surprise, an Inuit seal hunter spotted the derelict vessel only a few days later, trapped in ice near Skull Cliff, some 45 miles away. Captain Cornwall and his crew tracked her down and concluded that the ship was too badly damaged to safely survive the winter. They removed the remaining cargo and abandoned their ship for the final time, knowing that she would soon break up in the brutal icy waters of the Beaufort Sea. Captain Cornwall and his remaining crew were flown back to Vancouver. The SS Baychimo was officially deemed a loss, and the men went on with their lives. But later that winter, the Baychimo was spotted 300 miles east of where she was abandoned. This kicked off a long string of mysterious appearances by the ghostly ship. She was next spotted by a man named Leslie Melvin. He was traveling to Nome with his dog sled team when he came across the ship floating peacefully near the shore. A few months later, she was again discovered by a group of prospectors. At first, the sightings were an odd surprise, but nothing too extraordinary. The area was, and still is, extremely treacherous. It wasn't uncommon for ships to be overtaken by the ice and abandoned by their crews. Typically, once a ship was abandoned, she would succumb to the elements in a few days or weeks. But occasionally, one of these ships would survive for a season or two, before finally foundering in the ice. So when the Baychimo appeared in the distance again and again over the next several months, locals didn't think much of it. But as time went on and the derelict ship kept appearing, stories began to circulate that something supernatural was guiding the phantom ship. Those who spotted her claimed that it appeared that she was being piloted by some unseen crew as she drifted away from rocky shoals and other hazards that would challenge even vessels manned by skilled navigators. In 1933, her legend grew when a group of Inuit people were forced to shelter on the ghost ship when a freak storm trapped them in her hull for 10 days. These strange encounters helped earn the Baychimo a reputation as a cursed ship. Later that summer, she was boarded by the crew and passengers of the Trader, a small schooner that was on a research expedition to collect Alaskan and Arctic wildflowers. Soon after they finished exploring the ship, she disappeared in the night. But throughout the remainder of their voyage, the Baychimo would appear several more times, seeming to follow them. In November 1939, there was an attempt to salvage her by Captain Hugh Paulson, but his vessel was ill-equipped to safely take control of the larger Baychimo. This was the last officially recorded boarding of the ship. She was spotted several more times throughout 1939, but she always seemed to elude capture. Recorded sightings slowed considerably during World War II and the years after. It was assumed that she finally succumbed to her long overdue fate, and she was more or less forgotten. But then, miraculously, she was spotted by a group of Inuit people in March 1962, floating near the shore along the Beaufort Sea. Her last recorded sighting took place in 1969, when she was seen drifting in heavy pack ice, 38 years after she was originally left for dead. Though she hasn't been seen in decades, her mystery continues. Her unnatural ability to remain afloat unmanned in one of the most treacherous bodies of water continues to baffle investigators. In 2006, the Alaskan government commissioned a project to solve her mystery, but to date, nothing has been found. The sightings we know about are only the ones that were recorded to history. How many others managed to explore the phantom ship? What did they find when they explored her empty cabins or ventured deep into her cargo holds? Was there something supernatural that guided her? How did she survive so long? And did she finally sink? Or is she still out there, drifting in some far off, forgotten stretch of the Arctic, waiting to be found once again? The Lighthouse Ghost of Yaquina Bay by Lishan M. Miller. Situated at Yaquina on the coast of Oregon is an old deserted lighthouse. It stands upon a promontory that juts out, dividing the bay from the ocean, and is exposed to every wind that blows. Its weather-beaten walls are wrapped in mystery. On an afternoon when the fog comes drifting in from the sea and completely envelops the lighthouse, and then stops in its course as if its object had been attained, it is the loneliest place in the world. At such times, those that chance to be in the vicinity hear a moaning sound like the cry of one in pain, and sometimes a frenzied call for help pierces the death-like stillness of the waning day. Far out at sea, ships passing in the night are often guided in their course by a light that gleams from the lantern tower, where no lamp is ever trimmed. In the days when Newport was but a handful of cabins, roughly built and flanked by an Indian camp across the bar, there sailed a sloop grotesquely rigged and without a name. The arrival of a vessel was a rare event, and by the time the stranger had dropped anchor abreast the village, the whole population were gathered on the strip of sandy beach to welcome her. She was manned by a swarthy crew, and her skipper was a beetle-browed ruffian with a scar across his cheek from mouth to ear. A boat was lowered, and in it a man about 40 years of age, accompanied by a young girl, were rowed ashore. The man was tall and dark, and his manner and speech indicated gentle breeding. He explained that the sloop's water casks were empty, and was directed to the spring that poured down the face of the yellow sandstone cliff a few yards up the beach. Issuing instructions in some heathenish, unfamiliar tongue to the boatmen, he devoted himself to asking and answering questions. The sloop was bound down the coast to Coos Bay. She had encountered rough weather off the Columbia River bar and had been driven far off her course. To the young lady, his daughter, the village proved most trying. She was not a good sailor. If, therefore, accommodations could be secured, he wished to leave her ashore until the return of the sloop a fortnight later. The landlady of the hotel had a room to spare, and by the time the water casks were filled, arrangements had been completed which resulted in the transfer of the fair traveler's luggage from the sloop to the hotel. The father bade his daughter an affectionate adieu and was rowed back to the vessel, which at once weighed anchor and sailed away in the golden dusk of the summer evening. Muriel, that was the name she gave. Muriel Travenard was a delicate-looking, fair-haired girl still in her teens, very sweet and sunny-tempered. She seemed to take kindly to her new environment, accepting its rude inconveniences as a matter of course, though all her own belongings testified to the fact that she was accustomed to the refinements and even luxuries of civilization. She spent many hours each day idling with a sketch block and pencil in the grassy hollow in the hill, seaward from the town, or strolled upon the beach or over the wind-swept uplands. The fortnight lengthened to a month, and yet no sign of the sloop or any sail rose above the horizon to southward. "You've no cause to worry," said the landlady. "Your father's safe enough. No rough weather since he sailed, and as for time, a ship's time is as uncertain as a woman's temper, I've heard my own father say." "Oh, I'm not anxious," replied Muriel. "Not in the least." It was in August that a party of pleasure seekers came over the coast range and pitched their tents in the grassy hollow. They were a merry company, and they were not long in discovering Muriel. Such a pretty girl, exclaimed Cora May, who was herself so fair that she could afford to be generous. I am sure she does not belong to anybody about here. We must coax her to come to our camp. But the girl needed little coaxing. She found these light-hearted young people a pleasant interruption, and she was enthusiastically welcomed by all, young and old alike. She joined them in their ceaseless excursions, and made one of the group that gathered nightly around the campfire. There was one, a rather serious-minded youth who speedily constituted himself her cavalier. He was always at hand to help her into the boat, to bait her hook when they went fishing, and to carry her shawl or book or sketchbook. And she accepted these attentions as she seemed to accept all else, naturally and sweetly. The Cape Foulweather light had just been completed, and the house upon the bluff above Newport was deserted. Some member of the camping party proposed one Sunday afternoon that they pay it a visit. We have seen everything else there is to see, remarked Cora May. It is just an ordinary house with a lantern on top, objected Muriel. You can get a good view of it from the bay. Besides, it is probably locked up. Somebody has the key. We can soon find out who, said Harold Welsh. And we haven't anything else to do. Accordingly, they set out in a body to find the key. It was in the possession of the landlady's husband, who had been appointed to look after the premises. He said he had not been up there lately, and seemed surprised after a mild fashion that anyone should feel an interest in an empty house. But he directed them how to reach it. You go up that trail to the top of the hill, and you'll strike a road. But you won't find anything worth seeing after you get there. It ain't anywhere like the new light. With much merry talk and laughter, they climbed the hill and found the road, a smooth and narrow avenue, overshadowed by dark young pines winding along the hilltop to the rear of the house. It stood in a small enclosure, bare of vegetation. The sand was piled in little wind-swept heaps against the board fence. There is a walk paved with brick, leading from the gate around to the front, where 2 or 3 steps went up to a square porch with seats on either side. Harold Welch unlocked the door, and they went into the empty hall that echoed dismally to the sound of human voices. Rooms opened from this hallway on either hand, and in the L at the back there were the kitchen, storerooms, and pantry, a door that gave egress to a narrow veranda, and another shutting off the cellar. At the rear of the hall the stairs led up to the second floor, which was divided like the first into plain square rooms. But the stairway went on, leading up to a small landing where a window looked out to northward, and from which a little room, evidently a linen closet, opened opposite the window. There was nothing extraordinary about this closet at first glance. It was well furnished with shelves and drawers, and its only unoccupied wall space was finished with simple wainscoting. "Why," cried one as they crowded the landing and overflowed into the closet, "this house seems to be falling to pieces." He pulled at a section of the wainscoting, and it came away in his hand. "Hello, what's this? Iron walls?" "It's hollow," said another, tapping the smooth black surface disclosed by the removal of the panel. "So it is," cried the first speaker. "I wonder what's behind it. Why it opens." It was a heavy piece of sheet iron, about 3 feet square. He moved it to one side, set it against the wall, and peered into the aperture. "How mysterious!" exclaimed Muriel, leaning forward to look into the dark closet, whose height and depth corresponded to the dimensions of the panel. It went straight back some 6 or 8 feet, and then dropped abruptly to what seemed a soundless well. One more curious than the rest crawled in and threw down lighted bits of paper. "It goes to the bottom of the sea," he declared, as he backed out and brushed the dust from his clothes. "Who knows what it is, or why it was built?" "Smugglers," suggested somebody, and they all laughed, though there was nothing particularly humorous in the remark. But they were strangely nervous and excited. There was something uncanny in the atmosphere of the deserted dwelling that oppressed them with an unaccountable sense of dread. They hurried out, leaving the dark closet open, and climbed up into the lantern tower, where no lamp has been lighted these many years. The afternoon, which had been flooded with sunshine, was waning in a mist that swept in from the sea and muffled the world in dull gray. "Let us go home," cried Cora May. "If it were clear, we might see almost to China from this tower. But the fog makes me lonesome." So they clambered down the iron ladder and descended the stairs, passing out through the lower hall into the gray fog. Harold Welch stopped to lock the door, and Muriel waited for him at the foot of the steps. The lock was rusty, and he had trouble with the key. By the time he joined her, the rest of the party had disappeared around the house. "You're kind to wait for me," said he, as they caught step on the brick pavement and moved forward. But Muriel laid her hand upon his arm. "I must go back," she said. I dropped my handkerchief in the hall upstairs. I must go back and get it." They remounted the steps, and Welch unlocked the door and let her pass in. But when he would have followed, she stopped him imperiously. "I'm going alone," she said. "You are not to wait. Lock the door and go on. I will come out through the kitchen." He objected, but she was obstinate, and perhaps because her lightest wish was beginning to be his law of life, he reluctantly obeyed her. Again the key hung in the lock. This time it took him several minutes to release it. When he reached the rear of the house, Muriel was nowhere to be seen. He called her 2 or 3 times and waited, but, receiving no reply, concluded that she had hurried out and joined the rest whose voices came back to him from the avenue of pines. She had been nervous and irritable all afternoon, so unlike herself that he wondered more than once if she were ill, and wary of his close attendance. It occurred to him now that possibly she had taken this means to rid herself of his company. He hurried on, for it was growing cold and the fog was thickening to a rain. He had just caught up with the stragglers of the party, and they were beginning to chafe him at being alone, when the somber stillness of the darkening day was rent by a shriek so wild and weird that they who heard it felt the blood freeze suddenly in their veins. They shrank involuntarily closer and looked at each other with blanched cheeks and startled eyes. Before anyone found voice, it came again. This time, it was a cry for help, thrice repeated in quick succession. "Muriel, where is Muriel?" demanded Welsh, his heart leaping in fear. "Why, you ought to know," cried Cora May. "We left her with you." They hurried toward the deserted house. "She went back to get her handkerchief," explained Welsh. "She told me not to wait, and I locked the door and came on." "Locked her in that horrid place? Why did you do it?" exclaimed Cora indignantly. "She said she would come out by way of the kitchen," replied he. "She could not. The door is locked, and the key is broken off in the lock," said another. "I noticed it when we were rummaging around in there." They began to call encouragingly. "Muriel, we are coming. Don't be afraid." But they got no reply. "Oh, let us hurry," urged Cora. "Perhaps she has fainted with fright." In a very few minutes they were pouring into the house and looking and calling through the lower rooms. Then up the stairs, and there, upon the floor in the upper chamber, where the gray light came in through the curtainless windows, they found a pool of warm, red blood. There were blood drops in the hall and on the stairs that led up to the landing, and in the linen closet. They picked up a blood-stained handkerchief. But there was nothing else. The iron door had been replaced, and the panel in the wainscoting closed, and try as they might, they could not open it. They were confronted by an apparent tragedy, appalled by a fearful mystery, and they could do nothing. Nothing. They returned to the village and gave the alarm, and reinforced, came back and renewed the hopeless search with lanterns. They ransacked the house again and again from tower to cellar. They scoured the hills in the vain delusion that she might have escaped from the house and wandered off in the fog. But they found nothing, nor ever did, save the blood drops on the stairs and the little handkerchief. "It will be a dreadful blow to her father," remarked the landlady of the hotel. "I don't want to be the one to break it to him." And she had her wish. For the sloop, nor any of its crew ever again sailed into Yaquina Bay. As time went by, the story was forgotten by all those who joined in the wary search for the missing girl. But to this day it is said the blood stains are dark upon the floor in that upper chamber. and one there was who carried the little handkerchief next to his heart, till the hour of his own tragic death. I awoke with a terrific nightmare in Maine. I knew nothing about the ship. It hadn't been reported up here at the time. It was a terrible nightmare. A feeling of water. I awoke screaming, "Help! The sea monsters got me." The nightmare was a terminating experience. Something had ended. It was a brief dream. It was a very real gut feeling. I've never had that kind of experience before or since. It was the very next day that I got the first piece of information that the ship was overdue. Reverend Granville Henthorne, father of Mark Henthorne, third engineer on the SS Poet. Henthorne wasn't the only one who experienced a prophetic dream about the ill-fated SS Poet. The aging freighter left Philadelphia with a crew of 34 on October 24, 1980. She was never heard from again. There wasn't even a distress call. It was the first time in nearly 20 years that a US-flagged vessel vanished without a trace. The SS Poet was an unremarkable ship. Initially designed to carry troops in World War II under the name USS General Omar Bundy, by 1980 she was well into her second life serving as a bulk cargo carrier. Many of her former fleetmates had already been scrapped, but a select few carried on. With proper maintenance, their simple design could in theory sail for decades. Instead, the Poet's various owners routinely put off key repair work and carried out only what was absolutely required to keep the aging ship compliant. And even still, she was exempted from several modern safety regulations mandated by the 1974 Solis Convention. In early August 1980, the Poet sat in Corpus Christi, Texas, waiting as Hurricane Allen bore down on the city. The old ship was well past her prime, but with the right preparations, the storm posed little threat. Just a few months prior, on May 6th, the Poet passed her biennial Coast Guard dry dock safety inspection. And a year before that, in August 1979, she was recertified by the American Bureau of Shipping. But that inspection found serious issues with her number 1 hatch cover. While this was a major safety concern, she passed the inspection on the condition that the hatch be repaired when the ship was scheduled for dry docking in March 1982. This was indicative of the overall state of the Poet. As David Heindel, a former crew member, stated, she was on her last days, no question. But I didn't think the Coast Guard would have allowed us to sail if she was not seaworthy. This uneasy sense of confidence allowed the old ship to sail on. Some minor repairs were carried out after her last safety inspection. Following the Coast Guard's mandate, repairs were made to her boilers, main deck, and fire hose assemblies. But it was the bare minimum. Hurricane Allen passed over Corpus Christi, leaving the Poet largely unscathed. Her owners had secured a contract under the Food for Peace program to carry shipments of corn from the United States to Port Said, Egypt, where it would be distributed to people in need. So her owners had little reason to invest in a major overhaul. The ship was deemed safe, and after all, the only thing that mattered was eking out profit. For the crew who lived and sailed on her, this was not a major concern. The ship seemed safe enough, and they needed the work. The choice was never really theirs. And so the poet sailed on, heading to Philadelphia, where she would load her cargo and prepare for what should have been a routine voyage across the Atlantic. World War II presented a problem for the United States. How do you fight two major wars on opposite sides of the planet, each on the other side of a massive ocean? Combating Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan demanded the ability to quickly and efficiently transport troops and equipment all over the world. Workers across the United States banded together to produce a truly astonishing number of new vessels. Shipyards across the country buzzed with activity, constructing everything from simple Liberty ships to massive new aircraft carriers. 81 Type C-4 class ships, the largest cargo ships built by the United States Navy during World War II, were built between 1941 and 1945. 30 of these ships were specifically designed to carry troops. This variation was called the General G.O. Squire class transport. In 1944, the hull of AP-152 was laid down at the Kaiser Company shipyard in Richmond, California. These simple ships were designed to be built as quickly and efficiently as possible. Named USS General Omar Bundy, AP-152 was a typical example of her class. She was named after Major General Omar Bundy, a career U.S. Army officer who served in the American Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and most notably World War I. USS General Omar Bundy was launched on August 5, 1944. She was sponsored by Mrs. Lawrence Wainwright of Richmond. She displaced 9,950 tons light and 17,250 tons full. She measured 522 feet 10 inches or 159.36 meters in length, with a beam of 71 feet 6 inches or 21.79 meters. She was operated by a complement of 356 officers and enlisted men, and could carry up to 3,823 troops. She was powered by a single-screw steam turbine that could produce 9,900 shaft horsepower and achieve a service speed of 17 knots. After a brief fitting out period, USS General Omar Bundy entered service on January 6, 1945, and immediately went to work. She departed San Francisco Bay on March 10th with 2,700 sailors and mariners bound for Pearl Harbor, Ulithi, and Guam. After returning 1,700 troops to San Francisco, she sailed for the Atlantic to redeploy troops to the Pacific as the war in Europe came to an end. Throughout the final months of the war, USS General Omar Bundy transported troops all over the world. By the time she entered service, the Japanese and German navies were in shambles, and an Allied victory was inevitable. So while transport missions only a few months before would have been tense affairs, these late war voyages were mostly uneventful. After the war, the Omar Bundy continued repatriating troops until she was decommissioned on June 14, 1946. Following a very brief layup, she was transferred to the War Department on August 30, 1946, and spent the next 2.5 years repatriating troops, transporting refugees, and carrying personnel all over the world. But by the end of 1949, the displacements caused by World War II had mostly been settled, and transports like the General Omar Bundy no longer had a purpose. She was decommissioned on December 12, 1949, and transferred to the National Defense Reserve Fleet. She was mothballed in the James River in Virginia, where she would remain for the next 15 years. As Lottie Zucker-Fredette drove her son Hans Zucker to the Grand Point Terminal in South Philadelphia, she couldn't help shake the overwhelming sense of dread. There was no reason to worry about this upcoming voyage. Her oldest son was at a crossroads. He recently dropped out of SIU's quartermaster training program, and he was more interested in following the Phillies than facing the realities of planning his future. But he wasn't lazy, and he was happy to sign on as an able-bodied seaman on the SS Poet. The voyage would be a simple one, across the Atlantic and back. Still, as the mother hugged her son, she began to cry. Something just didn't feel right. Hans didn't quite understand, but he hugged her again and reassured her that he would be home for Christmas. He said goodbye and boarded the ship, ready to get to work. The Poet's irregular schedule made it difficult for Captain Leroy A. Warren to find crew, and the ship was understaffed even as her holds were cleaned and prepared for the upcoming voyage. Much of the deck crew from her previous voyage quit the ship. It was no secret that the Poet was a ship well past her prime. Her previous master, Captain Schindler, complained that vital repairs were often neglected, and on some voyages, critical equipment sometimes failed. On one trip, the freighter sailed half the voyage without working radar. The Poet had passed through a series of owners. In 1964, the Bethlehem Steel Corporation purchased the USS Omar Bundy and several other World War II-era transports that had sat in mothballs for well over 10 years and converted them into modern cargo ships. The Bundy was renamed SS Portmar and operated under a Bethlehem Steel subsidiary, the Kalmar Line. She remained with the company until it folded in 1976. The Portmar was then sold to the Ashley Steamship Company on August 10th of that year and renamed the SS Port. She was sold one last time on May 11, 1979 to the Hawaiian Eugenia Corporation and renamed the SS Poet. While the ship was showing her age, her living quarters were comfortable and surprisingly spacious. Her crew lounge even had a piano, though it was severely out of tune. In the days leading up to her scheduled departure, a call was put out for additional crew. Soon, men began trickling in. The Poet may not have been the best assignment in the world, but work was work. 23-year-old Stephen Connors and 31-year-old Ricky Saley joined the ship as seamen. Neither man planned to return to the sea after this voyage. Connors was working to get a job at an electronics plant near his home in New Jersey. His wife Cindy was pregnant and due to give birth sometime around Christmas. With the kid on the way, Connors was no longer interested in leaving home for long stretches of time. He would earn a bit of money on the Poet, and he would be home in time for the birth of his child. Ricky Saley planned for a 20-year career with the Navy. He spent 12 years sailing throughout the world, but a knee injury led to a medical discharge and an uncertain future. He returned to Ohio, but the recession made it difficult to find work. He eventually relocated to his wife's hometown of Philadelphia and applied for a job at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. But the hiring process was slow, and in the meantime, he took work on various ships. By the time he signed on with the Poet, he had secured an interview with the Navy Yard. He planned to complete a voyage and earn enough money to tide his family over until he finally got the job he was hoping for. Another seaman, Edward E. Bradley, felt lucky when he landed a job on the Poet. The 24-year-old man had struggled most of the year to find work. He just had a job on another ship canceled at the last minute, and he was grateful to finally catch a break. He was saving for college, and he was excited that he would be home for Christmas. Bradley was one of 13 siblings, and he was eager to finally get a holiday picture with the entire family all together. While the plan was to be back in time for Christmas, Chief Steward Eddie Sylvester knew that there was a chance that they would get held up, and he put in an order for Christmas candy just in case. As the Poet was loaded with 13,500 tons of yellow corn, her bows seemed to settle deeper than her stern by nearly 2 feet. Before they departed, a surveyor raised the imbalance with Captain Warren, but the master was unbothered. He said that he would correct the imbalance by shifting around barrels of fuel. As final preparations were made, Second Mate Bill King closely watched reports of a gathering storm system to their south. At 11:39 p.m. on Thursday, October 23rd, only hours before their scheduled departure, the Weather Service issued a gale warning that spanned from Cape Henlopen at the mouth of the Delaware River to Newport News, Virginia. But it seemed that the poet would only just clip the edge of the storm system as she sailed east. She had certainly survived much worse over the course of her long career, so a bit of heavy weather wasn't much of a concern. Some of the crew even hoped for a storm or two, just to make things interesting. In the early morning hours of October 24th, 1980, Gary Hope, a Delaware River pilot, boarded the poet as she began her voyage toward the Atlantic. He was unimpressed with the ship's steering, finding her sluggish, especially in the narrower sections of the channel. This wasn't enough of a problem to cause concern. The poet slowed to just 6 knots as she crossed between Cape May and Cape Henlopen, and Gary Hope climbed down a rope ladder into the waiting pilot boat. They turned away from the poet and raced back up the bay toward the Delaware River. The skies were gray, and the wind and waves were picking up. Gary Hope looked back at the poet one last time as she sailed through the open sea. He would be the last living person to ever set foot on the freighter. Just before midnight on October 25th, 1980, Carl Johnson, the weekend operator at Marine radio station WMH in the Dundalk Marine Terminal in Maryland, was reaching the end of an uneventful Saturday when he suddenly heard a ship's alarm signal crackle over his radio. It was an unmistakable automated distress call. He heard 6 4-second dashes at 1-second intervals before the message abruptly cut out. A complete alarm would include 12 dashes to get attention, followed by SOS and the ship's call sign repeated 3 times. And finally, a location, nature of the problem, and a request for assistance. With only the first 6 dashes, Johnson didn't have much to work with. No location, nothing to identify the sender, and no ability to identify the distance from which the message was sent. He phoned the Coast Guard station at Portsmouth, Virginia, and asked if they received the same message, but they didn't hear it. It was late, and a storm had just passed over the area. The autumn air was unsettled. Johnson spent the rest of the night listening for another distress call, but he never heard anything else. Two days prior, on Friday, October 24th, as the poet sailed clear of the eastern seaboard, her radio operator Joseph Vinek made 2 official calls, standard for any voyage. One was sent to the Hawaiian Eugenia office in Manhattan, the ship's owners reporting their departure. The second message was sent to the U.S. merchant vessel locating system via a Coast Guard station in Puerto Rico, reporting their location and destination. The call ended with a request to pass on this information to the Automated Mutual Assistance Rescue System, a voluntary worldwide reporting system that tracks ship positions in order to coordinate a response in the case of an emergency. Both of these systems only take incoming calls. They did not actively check in with vessels or put out any type of alert if they failed to report. Once underway, the poet was only required to send an update to the ship's owners every 48 hours to report their location, heading, and condition. She was also capable of making less formal calls. On Friday evening, third mate Bob Gove called his wife from the bridge. The conversation was casual and barely even mentioned the voyage aside from their destination in Egypt. At the time, the poet was almost certainly facing rough weather. She was approximately 250 miles into the Atlantic, and numerous other ships in the area were fighting through a storm with 73-mile-per-hour winds, 30-foot waves, and reduced visibility. These conditions were rough, but they were hardly anything that could seriously threaten a ship like the poet. Other ships in the area, like the Columbia, took a beating, but the but the storm weakened considerably throughout the day on Sunday, and by Monday morning, the sea was calm and the Columbia, just mildly bruised by the storm, continued on to the same port in Egypt that the poet sailed for. Over 48 hours had passed since the last time the poet sent an update to their owners, but no one took much notice. Chatham Radio sent a routine message on behalf of their owners to check in with the ship, but they received no reply from the poet. It took several days before the poet's absence raised any alarm. On Thursday, October 30th, her owners again tried to contact the ship through Chatham Radio. They received no reply. As the days passed, concern grew. Finally, on Monday, November 3rd at 9:59 a.m., Henry Bonnabel, owner of the Hawaiian Eugenia Company and the SS Poet, finally contacted the Coast Guard to report the missing ship, 10 days after she was last heard from. By now, the poet should be nearing Gibraltar. An alert was put out to ships in the area to keep an eye out for the missing vessel. As the situation slowly became clear, it was realized that Chatham Radio had been trying to contact the poet since October 27th, sending a message every 2 hours. 85 calls in total. Not a single one was answered. At 4:11 p.m., an urgent broadcast was sent to all ships on the Atlantic and Mediterranean, asking for any information on the missing ship. At first, the Coast Guard Rescue Coordination Center, the agency responsible for locating the missing ship, placed the poet in the uncertainty phase, the least critical of its 3 search and rescue categories. This was because a ship of the poet's size was almost never lost without first sending a distress call or at least an automated emergency signal. The poet was old, but as required by law, she was equipped with emergency position indicating radio beacons that should have triggered if the ship fell into distress. While considerable sea and air traffic capable of receiving these beacons had passed over the poet's route, no identifiable emergency signal was ever detected. The poet was not due in Egypt for another 5 days. So at first it seemed far more likely that the ship experienced a radio malfunction or maybe a power failure, which would warrant a less urgent response. But as the days ticked on, RCC staff began to worry that the situation was more serious. They learned that in addition to keeping in contact with their owner, the poet never missed her check-ins with USMER, but they failed to make their scheduled call on the 26th. It was also realized that the poet passed through the worst of the storm just after she was last heard from. By November 7th, it became painfully clear that the situation was more serious than initially thought, and a call was put out to begin a search for the missing ship. Over the coming days and weeks, 9 aircraft covered a total of 393,000 square miles, searching for any traces of the poet and her crew. But not a single sign of the ship. No life raft, no debris. Nothing was ever found. The poet simply vanished. On November 11th, a Navy plane picked up a faint distress signal, but they were unable to locate its source before they were forced to turn back to refuel. There were other fleeting clues. On November 15th, a small oil slick was spotted 1,200 miles off the east coast, but this seemed to vanish as quickly as it appeared. Another plane spotted a small orange object floating in the sea that they thought could be a life jacket, but no one on the surface was able to find or identify the object or figure out where it came from. The Atlantic is vast and enigmatic. These faint clues could have been anything. Family and friends of the 34 men on board waited anxiously for updates. But when it became clear that their loved ones would not be coming home, concern turned to outrage. Their anger turned toward Henry Bonnable and the management of the poet. It was quickly discovered that another ship under Bonnable's management at a previous company, the Silver Dove, sank in the Pacific in 1973. The loss was attributed to poor maintenance and rusted hull plates. Fortunately, no lives were lost in the sinking. Another ship owned by the Hawaiian Eugenia Company, the Flora, went dead in the water in the Atlantic only 2 weeks after the poet was reported missing. Ironically, the drifting ship was discovered by the SS Penny, the poet's nearly identical sister ship, also owned by Bonnable. The Flora was in such poor condition that she never sailed again. The Penny was also found to be in desperate need of serious repair, but somehow she remained in service until she was finally retired in 1983 when her certification was revoked due to safety concerns. 3 different agencies were tasked with investigating the loss of the poet: the National Transportation Safety Board, the Committee on Merchant and Marine Fisheries, and the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Board of Investigation. All 3 organizations concluded that the poet was likely lost during the storm she passed through shortly after her departure. But they each had different theories on how exactly she went down, including a faulty hatch cover, synchronously rolling, and undetected damage to her hull. It was also found that the inspectors who had certified the poet in the months before her disappearance were inexperienced and might not have scrutinized the ship as closely as they should have. Some even believe that the poet's sudden disappearance could be explained by a rogue wave, similar to the one that nearly took down the SS Michelangelo in 1966. But this was all speculation. Without any witnesses or traces of the missing ship, what caused her to sink will probably never be known. For a time, the story garnered some attention. A popular theory posited that the ship was either hijacked, involved in drug smuggling, or even played a role in the Iran-Contra affair. But there's absolutely no evidence to back up any of this tabloid speculation. It seems far more likely that the poet was an aging, poorly maintained ship that finally fell to the punishing conditions of the North Atlantic. Henry Bonnable and his company faced no consequences for the disaster. In 1981, he collected a $4 million insurance payment for the missing ship. The following year, he was awarded a $25 million government contract. He continued working in merchant shipping until his retirement. He died at the age of 95 in 2015. The loss of the poet was quickly eclipsed by the sinking of the Marine Electric in 1983, another aging World War II-era ship lost due to poor maintenance. The 2 disasters finally prompted significant reforms to maritime safety and Coast Guard rescue operations. But none of this provided much comfort or any answers for the family and friends of the 34 men who vanished with the poet. Their lives were expended, enriching a man who probably didn't even know their names. In 1825, the Cincinnati Literary Gazette published a story called The Ice Ship. Narrated by an old sea captain, the story tells of a voyage from his youth across the Baltic. Assigned the night watch, the old sea captain describes the bitter cold and persistent threat of ice and storms. On one of those cold moonlit nights, a lookout spotted a ship looming on the horizon. They fired their signal gun and approached the vessel. As she came into clear view, they saw that her sails were unkept and she was covered in ice. Our narrator says her rigging exhibited every prismatic color as it quivered in the moonbeam. As they drew closer, they realized that her hull was encased in a thick layer of ice, A helmsman stood at the ship's wheel. The crew called out to ask, "What ship is that?" But the helmsman remained still, staring straight ahead. They tried other languages, but he ignored them all. Finally, they decided to send a boarding party to inspect the strange ship and speak with her elusive crew. As they rowed out to the ghostly ship, they heard nothing but the sounds of waves lapping at her hull. After securing a line and climbing aboard, they found her decks covered in a thick layer of ice. Making their way to the helmsman, one of the men tripped over something on the deck. It was a man, his frozen dead eyes staring up at the sky. More followed. When they finally reached the helmsman and lifted their lamp to his face, they realized that he was dead as well, frozen solid to the wheel, staring ahead into the void. In the captain's cabin, they found the master of the ship, frozen like the others. His face contorted in a wild look of horror. His eyes conveyed a sense of dread that the narrator could never forget. Overtaken by the terror, the boarding party fled the phantom ship as fast as they could. As soon as they returned to the safety of their own ship, the winds changed, and the ice ship vanished into the darkness. It's a tale that has been told and retold. In some versions, the boarding party finds the captain's log and learns that the ship was searching for the Northwest Passage. In others, the nameless ship is called the Gloriana. More commonly, the phantom ship is called the Octavius. It's one of the most popular ghost ship stories out there, and you'll find it listed all over the internet. But as far as any researcher can tell, it's just a story. A creepy tale that appeared in a literary magazine almost 200 years ago. While the story of the Octavius is one of fiction, it conjures the very real unease evoked by a ship left to drift the vast and unknowable sea. An uncanny reminder of our own impending fate. In 2013, an alarming story popped up in the news. A ghost ship filled with cannibal rats was heading straight for the coast of England. The story sparked a minor media frenzy picked up by numerous news outlets, many of them reading the report with a chuckle. Just as quickly as it appeared, the story faded away. Anyone who took it seriously would be relieved in the coming days and months when the vermin-infested cruise ship failed to arrive on the coast of England. While the strange news story was wildly exaggerated and inaccurate, the ship it was based on was very real. In the 1970s, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev commissioned a fleet of 8 new cruise ships to be built at the shipyards in Kraljevica, Yugoslavia, present-day Croatia. The massive project, called Project 1454, was a favor to the Yugoslavian dictator Tito in his bid to revitalize the country's shipbuilding industry. Built between 1974 and 1978, each ship was named after a famous Soviet actress. While one of these ships, yard number 413, took shape on the slipway, one of the most iconic actresses in Soviet cinema, Lyubov Orlova, passed away at the age of 72 on January 26, 1975. The new ship was named in her honor and launched on November 3rd that same year. One of the 4 ships built for the Far Eastern Shipping Company based in Vladivostok, the MV Lyubov Orlova entered service on July 19, 1976. She initially sailed expedition cruises along the Soviet coast in and around the Vladivostok area and up to the Arctic. Like her sister ships, the Lyubov Orlova was built with a reinforced hull designed to withstand ice impacts. She came in at 4,251 gross tons and measured 295 feet or 90 meters in length, with a beam of 53 feet or 16 meters. She was powered by twin diesel engines that could generate a combined 5,209 horsepower and achieve a cruising speed of around 12 knots. The Lyubov Orlova was by no means luxurious, but she offered comfortable accommodations. She was equipped with 59 all-outside cabins, each equipped with a private bathroom. She could carry 110 passengers with a crew of 70. She boasted a large observation deck, a 100-seat dining room, 2 cafes, one with a 40-seat bar, and the other with 60 seats that could double as a cinema or a lecture hall, as well as a large music room with a dance floor and a bandstand. In 1978, the ship was chartered and sent to Canada to shoot the movie Bear Island, starring Donald Sutherland and Vanessa Redgrave. The ship was repainted and called the MS Morning Rose for the film, a fitting role for a ship named after a star. After the fall of the Soviet Union, she began offering trips to Japan. These proved popular, with Russians looking to shop for goods previously unavailable in the economically depressed Soviet Union. Former crew members remembered a happy ship, and passengers seemed to love their time on board. From the moment people took to the sea, they returned with unnerving stories from their time at the edge of the world. Sights and sounds that delighted, amazed, and frightened a population that seldom traveled more than a mile or two in their entire lives. One of the most infamous of these tales is the story of the Flying Dutchman. While the myth seems to have emerged sometime in the 1600s, the story did not appear in print until John Macdonald's travels in various parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa during a series of 30 years and upwards was published in 1790. In it he writes, "The weather was so stormy that the sailors said they saw the Flying Dutchman. The common story is that this Dutchman came to the Cape in distress of weather and wanted to get into the harbor, but could not get a pilot to conduct her and was lost in that ever since, in very bad weather, her vision appears." For the next 2 centuries, the phantom ship appeared in dozens of texts, usually associated with bad weather at the stretch of water off the southern end of Africa that connects the South Atlantic with the Indian Ocean. This marked one of the most dangerous stretches of the route captains took between Europe and India and Southeast Asia, since Europeans first rounded the Cape starting with Portuguese explorer Bartolomeu Dias in 1487. The Cape of Good Hope in modern-day South Africa marks the beginning of the Cape, where warm water from the Gallus Current collides with cold water from the Benguela Current, producing some of the most volatile sailing conditions in the world. As the Cape Passage claimed more and more vessels over the years, it's no wonder that this became the canonical home of the infamous Flying Dutchman. By the late 17th century, the passage came to be dominated by the Dutch East India Company. Some sources claim that the fabled ship was at least partially inspired by the story of the Dutch captain Bernard Foch, who was known for the speed of his passages between the Netherlands and Java. It was said that he owed his speed to a pact with the devil. Other stories attribute the Flying Dutchman to a Captain van der Decken, who encountered a brutal storm as he began to round the Cape. Though his crew begged him to wait for the weather to pass, he pressed forward, claiming that he would bring his ship round the Cape even if he had to sail until doomsday. This arrogant disregard for the fury of nature angered the gods of the sea, who took their revenge by trapping the stubborn captain and his crew there for all eternity, doomed to never find a safe harbor. Whatever the origin of the myth, numerous sailors throughout the centuries have claimed to have very real encounters with the phantom ship. One of the most famous sightings occurred on board a Royal Navy ship, HMS Viconti, in 1881, when future King George V and his brother, Prince Albert Victor, served as part of her crew. The sighting was recorded as follows. July 11th. At 4 a.m., the Flying Dutchman crossed our bows. A strange red light as of a phantom ship all aglow, in the midst of which light the masts, spars, and sails of a brig 200 yards distant stood out in strong relief as she came up on the port bow, where also the officer of the watch from the bridge clearly saw her, as did the quarterdeck midshipman, who was sent forward at once to the forecastle. But on arriving, there was no vestige nor any sign whatever. Any material ship was to be seen either near or right away to the horizon, the night being clear and the sea calm. 13 persons altogether saw her. At 10:45 a.m., the ordinary seaman who had this morning reported the Flying Dutchman fell from the fore topmast cross trees onto the topgallant forecastle and was smashed to atoms. Another sighting came from a British ship in 1835 that reported nearly colliding with the Flying Dutchman in a storm before the phantom ship vanished in midair. Numerous similar stories followed, always telling the same unsettling tale of an unnaturally fast sailing ship, often appearing during a storm, before vanishing without a trace. Sightings of the Flying Dutchman were usually seen as a bad omen, a promise that something bad lay just over the horizon. Strangely, or maybe tellingly, the last stories of the Flying Dutchman appeared during the chaos of World War II. Since then, the mythical ship seems to have been relegated to the past. But that doesn't mean that ghost ships, either real or imagined, don't continue to capture the public imagination. By the mid-1990s, the MV Lyubov Orlova had settled into her post-Soviet career, offering chartered expedition cruises for adventurous passengers looking to explore the world's poles. Her simple but sturdy reinforced hull made her ideal for these voyages, and her small and nimble size allowed her to easily navigate around glaciers and through icy fjords. The ship fell under new ownership in 1996, and in 1999 the now over 20-year-old ship was refurbished to bring her up to date. She was soon chartered by a company called Marine Expeditions. The adventure cruise market was growing, and these expeditionary voyages proved popular. In 2002, the Orlova underwent a much more extensive overhaul to bring the aging Soviet liner into the 21st century. For the next decade, she was chartered by a variety of travel companies, primarily Quark Expeditions for voyages to the Antarctic, and North Expeditions for voyages to the Arctic. The only real problem she ever faced during her long career came on November 27, 2006, when she ran aground on Deception Island in Antarctica. A Spanish Navy icebreaker called the Las Palmas was sent to free her, and she was able to sail to Tierra del Fuego under her own power. The incident never proved any real threat to the ship or the people on board. The Lyubov Orlova's expedition cruises consistently proved popular and profitable, and the ship was in hot demand from the various companies that chartered her. Despite her popularity, the Orlova was aging, and these voyages frequently sent her sailing through rough and unpredictable weather. While this was what she was designed for, like any ship, she required upkeep. Unfortunately, her owners, Lyubov Orlova Shipping Company Limited, based out of Malta, and Novorossiysk, consistently put off even basic maintenance on the ship. By 2010, this deferred maintenance became impossible to hide. On July 2, 2010, in St. John's Harbor in Newfoundland, Glenn Mackey, an inspector representing Transport Canada, boarded the Lyubov Orlova for a routine inspection. He immediately noticed broken lifeboat cranes and inoperable fire doors. When he observed a lifeboat drill, he was horrified by the crew's lack of training. His notes described the ordeal as a fiasco. But this was just the start. He found that the ship's backup compass was inoperable, and the compass deviation log was, in his words, suspiciously accurate. The ship's radio officer was visibly nervous as he explained that the compass wandered just a bit, but he claimed that it was all okay. Clearly, it wasn't. At that point, the ship's captain ushered the inspector into his cabin. According to Mackey, quote, "He closed the door behind him and immediately presented me with a pen and what looked like a piece of cardboard, and he asked me to write down how much money I want." Mackey refused. He left the ship and immediately went to the police to report the incident and the horrifying condition of the ship slated to begin carrying passengers in just a few days. The captain claimed that the ordeal was just a misunderstanding. While the Russian captain's intentions could have been lost in translation, the sorry state of the Lyubov Orlova was undeniable. Since the days of the Flying Dutchman, ghost ships have become more tangible. Rather than a phantom ship sailing with a ghostly crew, the term has come to be associated with ships left abandoned. People now think of the Mary Celeste, the Carol A. Deering, or the Baychimo. Some are more mysterious than others, but each holds a unique fascination. There's something uncanny about a ghost ship. It's a place that once provided comfort and safety, but now, bereft of humanity, they sail on without us. They no longer serve their purpose, and yet they persist. Like a corpse unburied, they offer a perverse reprieve in the unrelenting passage of time, an unending march into the abyss. Glenn Mackey's dire report on the condition of the MV Lyubov Orlova prompted Transport Canada to issue a stop-sail order, halting all planned cruises until the safety issues could be rectified. Without clearance from Canadian authorities to set sail, the Orlova sat in limbo in St. John's Harbor waiting to learn her fate. At first, the situation seemed salvageable. Cruise North Expeditions had already chartered the ship for the summer of 2010 for a set of voyages up the coast of Labrador, Baffin Island, and various Arctic destinations such as Resolute and Beechy Island, the same place where members of the ill-fated Franklin expedition were buried. Hoping to get the season underway as soon as possible, Cruise North planned to pay for the repairs on behalf of the ship's owners. It was not uncommon for a charter company to cover minor maintenance costs, but as the company realized the severity of the situation, paired with the already large outstanding balance owed to them, they realized that it was increasingly unlikely that the Orlova's owners would ever pay them back. They had to act quickly. If the Orlova was allowed to leave Canada, they would likely never see any payment at all. The company filed a $250,000 lawsuit against the Orlova's owners, and a United States court issued an order to seize the ship as collateral. Lyubov Orlova Shipping Company countersued. They claimed that the Orlova was tight, staunch, and strong, properly manned, and seaworthy at all times, and alleged that Cruise North miscalculated the cost of chartering the ship. Eventually, through multiple lawsuits, claims against the ship exceeded $2 million. St. John's Port Authority filed a suit of their own for unpaid docking fees and security costs as the cruise liner rotted away, taking up valuable space in their harbor. In September 2010, Lyubov Orlova Shipping Company had all but abandoned the ship. This left the 51 Russian and Ukrainian crew members in limbo. The various seamen, housekeepers, galley cooks, and officers had lived on the ship for almost a year. They were technically free to leave whenever they wanted, but if they did, they would be giving up their pay, which would not be issued until their contracts were finished when the ship was planned to dock in Tenerife at the end of the season. But it was becoming increasingly clear that the ship would never make it to Tenerife, and the crew, most of them virtually penniless in a foreign country with no visa, completely dependent on a dying ship, grew restless. Life on board was strange. Thanks to the generosity of the various St. John's residents who donated meals to the derelict crew, they didn't go hungry or without fresh water. Movies were screened in the ship's lounge almost daily, usually comedies to lighten the mood. But as the ship decayed around them and the weeks turned into months, some began looking for a way to leave. The ship's owners launched a desperate lawsuit, hoping to keep the crew on board, but with hope dwindling that the ship would sail anytime soon and the prospects of payment seeming even less likely, the crew eventually began to abandon the Lyubov Orlova. This was usually at great personal expense for the low-earning workers, many of whom had to depend on family or help from the Russian government to return home. A lawsuit was launched on their behalf against the owners to collect roughly $300,000 in back pay. But this, and the various other debts owned by the owners of the Lyubov Orlova, were never paid. Despite various legal maneuvers and a desperate attempt to mortgage the ship, by the winter of 2010, the MV Lyubov Orlova was virtually abandoned in the St. John's Harbor. For the next 3 years, she was left to rot. Shortly after the MV Lyubov Orlova entered service in the late 1970s, the Soviet poet James Patterson spent some time aboard the gleaming white cruise ship. Patterson was close friends with Lyubov Orlova, the actress the ship was named after, and his time aboard the ship brought up fond memories of his friend and his time in the Navy. He was inspired to write the following poem, "The entire abyss weakly pulses," a characteristic peculiar to it. This apparent calm seems to mesmerize. What awaits us? A stellar expanse of ocean that is as old as all this world? At dawn in underwater space, it is time for us to dive. In December 2011, more than a year after she was abandoned, appraisers were hired by the Canadian Federal Court to assess the condition of the ship. The moment they boarded the Lyubov Orlova, they were transported into a nightmare. Absent any crew or the funds necessary to maintain her, the vessel quickly deteriorated. Burst pipes, broken windows, and damaged doorways let water seep into the ship, creating a dark and damp atmosphere inside. Mold and mildew quickly spread, and her ballast tanks filled with filthy water, creating an unnatural list. An infestation of rats soon moved in. Within just a few months, the modest cruise ship was transformed into a rotting hellscape, like something out of a horror movie. The appraisers concluded that any attempt to revitalize the ship would be too costly to ever turn a profit. In February 2012, she was purchased in a court-ordered sale by the Neptune International Shipping Company for $275,000. While it was clear that her passenger service days were long behind her, these new owners briefly explored the possibility of revitalizing the ship, but this never came to pass, and the Lyubov Orlova continued to rot in St. John's Harbor for another year. Fed up with the derelict ship, the Port Authority finally sued her new owners in November 2012 for back docking fees. It was well past time the ship found a new home. Finally, a tug called the Charlene Hunt was commissioned to tow the Orlova to the Dominican Republic, where she would finally be scrapped. On January 23, 2013, a tow line was attached, and the MV Lyubov Orlova finally left St. John's Harbor. But less than a full day into the trip, the tow line broke, sending the rotting ship adrift in the North Atlantic. The failed operation was insured for $850,000, but since the company never made a premium payment, there would never be any payout for the lost ship. Later investigations showed that the crew responsible for the tow lacked the proper equipment and experience for the operation. The Charlene Hunt was an aging vessel herself, nearing the end of her career. The tow line was woefully inadequate and separated just 3 hours after the ship left St. John's Harbor. Within days, panicked news reports began warning that the ship, filled with cannibal rats, was heading for the coast of England. The strange situation garnered more serious attention when the Orlova drifted toward the Hibernia oil platform 315 kilometers southeast of St. John's. Fearing a collision, Transport Canada hired the Maersk Challenger on February 2, 2013 to re-establish a tow line. The winter weather made the operation difficult. But a line was finally established, and the ship was towed clear from the oil platform. But she soon broke free once again. With the weather deteriorating and building swells, the salvage team determined that it would be too dangerous to try and establish another tow line. Since the ship was in international waters and no longer posed a threat to the oil platform or the environment, the mission was abandoned. The MV Lyubov Orlova was left to the mercy of the North Atlantic. During the operation, the crew secured a handful of emergency position indicating radio beacons in her lifeboats. These devices were programmed to send an emergency GPS signal once they were submerged in water. One of these beacons went off on February 23, 2013. Another was detected on March 8th. That was the last time that any position for the MV Lyubov Orlova was ever recorded. On March 12, a photo of a damaged lifeboat found near the Orlova's final position was sent to Transport Canada. But it was impossible to verify whether the lifeboat in the photo indeed belonged to the derelict vessel. When and if the Lyubov Orlova finally succumbed to the Atlantic is unknown, but she is presumed sunk by officials. That doesn't stop speculation that she might still be out there, drifting aimlessly, guided by some unknown force. A ghost ship that hints at something more. The promise that we may be able to stave off the abyss just a little bit longer. I am the last one left alive, freezing and starving to death on Isle Royale in Lake Superior. I just want Mom and Dad to know my fate. These were the final words of the SS Kamloops, found floating in a message in a bottle. It was located near the mouth of the Agawa River by a trapper in December 1928, a year after the Kamloops vanished with all hands during a storm on Lake Superior. The message was written by Alice Bettridge, a young assistant stewardess on the Kamloops. Her final words paint a depressingly hopeless fate, and for nearly 50 years, her despairing message and a few frozen bodies and objects were the only traces of the 250-foot package freighter ever found. The Kamloops soon became one of the most infamous ghost ships of the Great Lakes. But then, half a century later, on August 21st, 1977, a wreck was discovered northwest of Isle Royale. Lying on its side, the wreck was remarkably well preserved by the frigid waters of Lake Superior. It was soon confirmed that it was indeed the ghostly Kamloops. Hoping to solve her mystery, divers combed over the wreck, searching for clues that could explain what ultimately doomed the small freighter and her crew. They found a world frozen in time. As they explored deeper into the wreck, they discovered shoes, clothing, food, and numerous other personal objects perfectly preserved as if they were plucked from the day they were lost. Then a diver went deeper, climbing into the bowels of the ship. Down a stairway, he found her engine room, again perfectly preserved. As he explored the ghostly space, he noticed something move out of the corner of his eye. He whirled around, and to his horror, he was confronted by a ghostly white figure, floating only a few feet away from him. It was the body of a crew member, mummified by the frigid lake water, entombed forever in the engine where he worked 50 years before. While horrifying at first, the body is a grim reminder that the Kamloops took 22 lives with her the night she succumbed to the fury of Lake Superior. What ultimately sealed their fate remains a mystery. The Kamloops was nothing to write home about. She wasn't one of the massive bulk freighters that came to dominate the Great Lakes in the early half of the 20th century. Instead, she was small and economical, designed to traverse the Canadian canals of the St. Lawrence River. Built in England at the Furness Shipbuilding Company in Durham, Yard Number 68 was launched on May 20th, 1924. Coming in at just 250 feet or 76 meters in length, with a beam of 43 feet or 13 meters, the 2,402-ton package freighter was designed to carry general cargo to smaller ports all over the Great Lakes. She was given 2 rigged masts to help load and unload cargo, and she was powered by a single triple expansion steam engine that could produce around 1,000 horsepower and achieve a speed of around 9.5 knots. She was operated by 22 crew members. Work began almost immediately. After completing her sea trials on July 5, 1924, the Kamloops, named after the city in British Columbia, was sent to Denmark to pick up a load of freight before traveling to her new home across the Atlantic in Montreal. Once she arrived in the Great Lakes, she began the grueling schedule typical of a lake freighter. She was used to carry all sorts of goods from Montreal up to the small but growing Canadian ports that dotted Thunder Bay, Ontario. Her holds carried everything from grain and other bulk goods to consumer products like clothing, food, and industrial parts. She would sail as late into the season as possible, usually weeks or even months after many of the larger freighters were laid up for the season. Demand was high, and for many small communities in the upper Great Lakes, these shipments would be the last supplies to arrive before the long and brutal winter months left them virtually cut off from the outside world. These late-season voyages were treacherous, but most importantly to our owners, they were profitable. Captains earned their reputations through numbers. More runs meant more profit. A captain willing to dare the late-season gales could edge up his ship's numbers. While it was ultimately the captain's decision whether or not his ship sailed, there was considerable pressure from management to take risks. Heavy weather captains were rewarded with bonuses and career security. Time and time again throughout her short career, the Kamloops was pushed to her limits. In 1924, she was the last vessel of the season to pass through the Sault Ste. Marie Canal. In 1926, she became icebound on the St. Mary's River trying to carry out a late-season run. She remained trapped in the ice for 9 days before she was finally dislodged on December 11. Her owners, the Canadian Steamship Lines, released a statement claiming that the incident would not deter them because something like that only happened once every 50 years. The company pushed the Kamloops back into service as soon as they could the following year, a season that would prove to be her last. Captain William Bryan spent his life on the lakes. Born in Kingston, Ontario, Bryan's father taught him how to sail at an early age. When he was 21, he took a job on a lake freighter. For the next 21 years, he rose through the ranks, working on the Kenora and the Seguin, before eventually taking command of the Kamloops. By 1927, the 45-year-old captain was known as a skilled navigator who ran a happy ship. The Kamloops was held to a grueling schedule and spent a great deal of time waiting for locks and sitting in ports as cargo was loaded and unloaded. The long periods of downtime gave Captain Bryan and his crew plenty of time to bond, and these close ties were further strengthened by the often difficult sailing conditions the ship encountered during her late and early season runs. Late season runs were always riddled with anxiety. Crews were tired and anxious to begin their winter leave. The weather was often brutal and unpredictable. As fall gave way to winter, a relatively pleasant day could dissolve into a nightmare in just a few hours. Captain Bryan was no doubt eager to bring the season to an end as his ship was loaded with cargo in Port Colborne, Ontario on December 1, 1927. She carried a diverse cargo that included coiled wire, salt, candy, shoes, building supplies, and parts for paper-making machinery. The weather forecast was ominously ambiguous, with a cold front predicted to sweep down over the lakes from northern Canada. Captain Bryan knew that meant rough weather was coming, but when and how rough was anyone's guess. The best he could do for his ship and the 21 crew members on board was to finish the run as quickly as possible. As soon as the Kamloops cleared the dock, he ordered full ahead, sailing as quickly as their modest engine could carry them up the lakes. To his relief, as they crossed Lake Erie and began up Lake Huron, the weather held up well. But by the time they reached Sault Ste. Marie, things took a turn while they waited to pass through the locks. The wind picked up dramatically and temperatures plummeted. Lake Superior was whipped into a frenzy. The opportunity to finish this last run in peace seemed to have passed. At the locks, Captain Bryan wrote an anxious letter to his wife, telling her that the weather was bad and he would need to anchor near Whitefish Point to wait out the storm. Late-season gales were brutal, but they often passed quickly. This would delay his return home, but it would hopefully save him and his crew from a punishing run up Lake Superior. After clearing the Sault, the Kamloops joined a small fleet of freighters that made the same decision to wait out the storm in the protected bay. For 2 days, wind, waves, and snow lashed at the sheltering ships, but for now, they were safe. After spending 2 days sheltering in Whitefish Bay, Captain Bryan found himself in an increasingly impossible situation. The weather was not letting up. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. He realized that his prudence 2 days ago might have trapped him into an even more brutal run up Lake Superior. There was enormous pressure to finish the run. Every day that his ship sat anchored, they were bleeding money. If the weather got any worse, and it seemed to be deteriorating rapidly, he could risk not finishing the run at all, putting his career in serious jeopardy. As the storm grew worse, it seemed that it was now or never. So on December 5th, Captain Bryan decided that the Kamloops would press on. Other captains made the same decision. Another ship, the 283-foot Quedagh, was bound for Port Arthur and joined the Kamloops on her dash up Lake Superior. Their departure unfortunately coincided with a second, significantly more brutal cold front. Temperatures plummeted to as low as -38 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow was relentless, plunging those unlucky enough to be out on Lake Superior into a whiteout. Downbound ships limped into the Sioux, completely covered in a thick layer of ice. This was the maelstrom Kamloops and Quedagh sailed into when they left the safety of Whitefish Bay. Neither ship had a radio, and visibility was so bad that they could barely see each other's lights through the blizzard. The Quedagh led the way, while the Kamloops followed not far behind. Captain Roy Simpson of the Quedagh was essentially sailing blind as they inched further north, praying for the lights of safety. By dusk on the night of December 6th, Simpson knew that they had to be close to the rocky shoreline of Isle Royale, but he couldn't be sure where. Suddenly, a lookout shouted, "Rocks dead ahead." Captain Simpson sprang into action and grabbed the wheel himself, turning hard to starboard. After an agonizing few moments, his ship responded, narrowly avoiding the deadly rocks. When he was sure that his ship had avoided immediate disaster, he looked back to search for the Kamloops. Through the chaos, he could just barely make out her lights through the storm. He knew he had to warn them, and he let out a series of blasts from his horn. Not long after he sent the warning, the Kamloops disappeared in the maelstrom. Captain Simpson was still hours away from safety. He had to turn his attention to keeping his ship on course, fighting to avoid falling into a deadly trough. Fortunately, the Quedagh made it through the night. Captain Simpson and his crew were probably the last people to ever see the lights of the Kamloops. As the storm clouds cleared and ships limped into port, no one thought much about the missing Kamloops. Many thought that the small package freighter either found a sheltered inlet to ride out the storm, or at worst ran aground on some remote shore. Even Captain Simpson of the Quedagh, who warned the Kamloops about the rocks off Isle Royale, didn't think much of the ship's delayed arrival. While he was pretty sure that they probably didn't hear his warning calls over the roar of the storm, he assumed that any competent lookout could see the danger in time, just as they had on his ship. But as the days passed, concern grew. Finally, on December 12th, a party was sent to search for the missing ship. The Midland Prince, the Islet Prince, and a small fleet of fishing vessels scoured the area around Isle Royale, but no trace of the Kamloops or her crew were found. Being so late in the season, the weather quickly deteriorated, and by December 22nd, the search was unfortunately called off. The Kamloops was declared a loss with all hands, and the mystery of her final moments seemed like they would go unsolved. Then came a gruesome discovery on Isle Royale. On May 26, 1928, after the winter ice thawed away, a fisherman named David Lind was retrieving nets when he came across two bodies clad in life preservers near 12 o'clock point on the northwest coast of Isle Royale. Their vests were clearly labeled with a stenciled word, Kamloops. The Coast Guard cutter Crawford was dispatched to collect the remains and search the area. The receding ice revealed numerous remnants of the ill-fated ship. Life rings, broken hatch covers, cargo, pieces of her shattered pilot house, half a lifeboat, oars, and even Captain Bryan's personal trunk were found littered around the beach. On June 4th, 6 more bodies were discovered, painting a horrifying picture of what happened that night. All but one, first mate Honoré Genest, wore life jackets, and a lifeboat found nearby made it clear that these crew members had enough time to flee the Kamloops and make it to shore. The sub-zero temperatures, lashing wind, and unrelenting snow made survival all but impossible. While it's unlikely anyone survived more than a few hours, there were signs that someone tried to build a makeshift shelter. The horrors of the night were beginning to reveal themselves, but the mystery of the Kamloops' final moments remained unsolved. She became another ghost ship, lost to Lake Superior. It's one thing to imagine what the crew of the Kamloops went through in their final moments. It's another to hear it from them directly. Almost a full year after the tragedy, a trapper named Louis Coutu was hunting near the Agawa River in Ontario, just north of Sault Ste. Marie, when he came across a bottle floating in the mouth of the river. It contained a chilling note, scrawled in neat but desperate handwriting. He initially proposed selling the letter, but after the proposal sparked outrage, he turned it over to the family of the letter's writer, Alice Bettridge, a 23-year-old assistant stewardess on the Kamloops. Initially, the letter was thought to be a hoax, but Alice's family confirmed that the neat handwriting was a match. The letter offered a tragic window into Alice's final moments. "I am the last one left alive, freezing and starving to death on Isle Royal in Lake Superior. I just want Mom and Dad to know my fate." For the next 50 years, that was it. Nothing more was found, and the mystery of the Kamloops faded into local legend. A ghost story told around the mess table on cold winter nights on Lake Superior. But as the years went on, interest in the mystery endured. By the late 1970s, new sonar and diving technology offered tantalizing hope the ghost ship could maybe be found. Enthusiasts knew the general area where the Kamloops met her fate. Roy Oberg, a local fisherman and helmsman of the Voyager ferry that serviced Isle Royal, began searching the area with side-scan sonar. Eventually, he came across a large object resting on the lake bed near 12 o'clock point. Oberg told a group of local divers about the find, and soon Ken Merriman, Randy Salter, and Ken Engelbrecht began diving the area, looking for traces of the mysterious object. On August 21st, 1977, they came across the telltale signs of a shipwreck. Bundles of pipes, a ladder, and a brass barrel were scattered across the lake bed. They ventured further, slowly and methodically, until finally they came upon what they were searching for: a large mass looming before them. It was a shipwreck. They were only able to get a quick look at the mysterious wreck before they had to head back to the surface. Nothing was certain. An unknown wreck can always surprise divers, but they were almost sure that this was the fabled Kamloops. They kept their find a secret until they could return the following summer. It was on this dive that they found what they were looking for: her stern nameplate still bearing the name Kamloops. It was an incredible find. The remarkably well-preserved wreck offered a tantalizing window into the past. Shoes, clothing, even boxes of Lifesavers candy, their wrappers still pristine, though the candy inside dissolved away long ago. But the wreck held a more somber reminder of the people that once lived and worked on the ill-fated package freighter. Inside were bodies, mummified by the icy waters of Lake Superior, still floating where they died. Janet Grafton, who went by Nettie, the Kamloops' first stewardess, began working on the lakes in 1908. She was known for her infectious smile and radiant, jolly energy. Everyone loved her. In a letter written only days before the tragedy, she told a friend that 1927 would be her last season on the lakes. Her body is among those entombed in the wreck. A man floats in the engine room, dubbed Old Whitey due to his ghostly white appearance. He has become ingrained in the Kamloops legend. Divers note that you can still see the wedding ring on his finger. The discovery of the Kamloops offered some clues to what happened the night she sank. Her rudder and screws are in good condition, and her engine room telegraph was set at the finish with engines position, suggesting that her engines were shut off before she went down. Some believe that her smokestack broke away during the storm, rendering her boilers inoperable. Left powerless, she eventually succumbed to the raging wind and waves. Others believe she struck rocks and drifted for some time before finally sinking. There was, after all, enough time for a lifeboat to get free from the doomed freighter. It's also possible that she capsized after becoming hopelessly covered in ice. Ultimately, we'll never know what exactly brought down the freighter. Alice's body was among those found in Isle Royale in 1928. She was identified by her teeth. Nettie was the only other woman on board, and her teeth were false. In her note, she says, "Tell them it was just me who is not dead." She wrote in the past tense. A chilling acknowledgement that the end was near. It's a feeling none of us know. The imminent certainty that you are about to die. When you think of a ghost ship, what comes to mind? Do you picture some version of the Flying Dutchman, a phantom vessel sailing on its own? Or is it something like the Waratah, a ship filled with people that simply vanished without a trace? Maybe you picture the fictional Octavius, a derelict ship filled with the skeletons of her crew, drifting aimlessly through the vast emptiness of the sea. It's hard to grasp the intense isolation and uncertainty of ocean travel in the days before wireless communication, a time when crossing the horizon meant passing into the unknown. Uncertainty is one of our greatest fears. We try to keep it at bay with stories crafted to fill in the blanks. But even our most fanciful tales fail to explain the great unknowability of the sea. Legends and superstitions arise, and none capture the imagination quite like a ghost ship. A spooky tale that explains away the unknowable. While many of these stories are just fiction, others are all too real. A select few are told time and again, like the Mary Celeste. But others are almost completely forgotten. Their mystery deepens as time erases the details. This is one of those stories, the real tale of the sailing vessel Resolven, often referred to as the Welsh Mary Celeste. From the moment European explorers arrived in present-day Newfoundland, it was immediately clear that the region's waters were rich with fish. These valuable natural resources led to a series of conflicts as the colonists vied for control. In 1713, the French and British agreed to the Treaty of Utrecht, in which France recognized Britain's claim to the island, but allowed the French to fish the waters off the western shore. This agreement, called the Treaty Shore or French Shore, was reaffirmed and maintained through the 20th century. While this agreement was largely respected, tensions and war between the French and British led to a fraught relationship in the region. Ever suspicious of their longtime rival, the British maintained several Royal Navy ships in the area to routinely patrol and keep an eye on the French fishermen in what was called the Fishery Protection Service. By the late 1800s, as relations between the two countries grew friendlier, these patrols became somewhat uneventful. On August 28, 1884, one of these patrol ships, the gunboat HMS Mallard, under the command of Lieutenant Hamilton Brown, left St. John's and sailed northwest on what was expected to be another one of these routine voyages. By the next morning, August 29th, the weather was beautiful, offering gorgeous vistas of the surrounding area. As they steamed across the mouth of Trinity Bay, 30 miles east of Catalina, a large iceberg was spotted glistening in the distance, and a fog bank hung on the horizon out to sea. The peaceful morning was broken when a lookout called out, "Sail ho!" At first, the sighting was only acknowledged by the responsible officers, but soon, as it came into better view, every man on deck stared at the mysterious ship that loomed on the horizon. It was a brig under plain sail, but she sailed erratically, as if no one was controlling the vessel. When they grew closer, they noted some superficial damage. Her headgear was smashed, and some of the yards were broken off at the tip. Her lifeboats were missing, and no one seemed to be on deck. The men repeatedly hailed the strange ship, but they received no reply. Finally, Commander Brown ordered an officer and a small crew to board the ship and investigate. They lowered a boat and began rowing over. The mood was tense as the phantom vessel grew closer. They passed under her counter-stern and read her name and home port, Resolven, Aberystwyth, Wales. The vessel was ominously quiet as she creaked with the waves. Her derelict sails flapped in the breeze, and water gently lapped at her hull. No one called out or greeted them, or begged for help. The occasional gull shrieked overhead. Their boat bumped up against the hull, and the men cautiously boarded the vessel. As they climbed on deck, they found a perfectly seaworthy ship, with only minor superficial damage. Splitting up, they began a thorough search. They expected to find something horrible, but instead, they found a ship deserted but in near perfect order. In the captain's cabin, they found the logbook lying open on a table, and the chronometer ticking away. In the crew and passenger quarters, they found clothing and other personal effects undisturbed. Even the fire in the galley stove was still burning. It was as if everyone on board simply vanished. The last entry in the captain's logbook was made only 6 hours before and indicated nothing out of the ordinary. Baffled, the men returned to the Mallard and reported their findings. Captain Brown assigned a skeleton crew to man the derelict vessel, and they spent the next few hours cruising the area, searching for survivors in the water. But nothing was ever found. Finally, a towline was established, and the Mallard towed the Resolven back to shore, where further investigations were carried out. Commanded by Captain John James, the Resolven was a 143-ton wooden merchant brig. She typically sailed between Wales and various Canadian ports carrying timber and cod. She left Harbor Grace on August 27, 1884, bound for Snug Harbor in Labrador, where she would pick up a load of salted cod. On this voyage, she had a crew of 8, mostly Welsh sailors, and 4 local passengers. No trace of them was ever found. The incident ignited a fury of speculation over their fate. The leading theory related back to the large iceberg spotted by the Mallard just before the derelict vessel was discovered. It was speculated that the Resolven might have collided with the iceberg in the night, and thinking the ship was more severely damaged than she actually was, she was abandoned. Captain James and his passengers and crew then drowned when their small lifeboat was swamped in the open sea. But Captain James was an experienced navigator who had sailed all over the world, and his first mate, James Matthias, was another deeply experienced sailor. It's hard to believe that the captain would order his men to abandon the ship without being absolutely certain that there was no other option. Some even believe that the Resolven could have hit the iceberg after she was abandoned. Another theory posits that the Resolven might have gotten lost in the fog and collided with the rocks off Random Island. But this raises the same question. Why would the men abandon a perfectly seaworthy vessel? With few answers to the mystery, the Resolven was sold and re-entered service. 3 years later, she was wrecked while sailing to Newfoundland with a load of lumber. As the years went on, the mystery of the ghost ship Resolven faded from memory. But then, in 2013, the great-grandson of Captain James received an email from a Canadian woman with family in Deer Harbor, Newfoundland. She wrote that her grandfather and his older brother found a body on a small island off the coast of Random Island, the same month and year the Resolven was found abandoned. The body supposedly wore a captain's uniform and sat at a tree facing out to sea. The discovery was never reported, and the body was buried in an unmarked grave. The woman admitted that while the story had been passed down through her family, she was never able to verify whether or not it was true. But her grandfather and his brother somehow came into some money at around the same time. Captain James was carrying a large sum of money during the voyage, which was also never found. His widow wrote numerous letters to the Admiralty, begging for any information on her missing husband and the money that should have gone to her. It never did, and she died in poverty. Whether this story is true, or even related to the ghost ship, will never be known. Like the Mary Celeste, the story of the Resolven leaves more questions than answers. As time passes, stories change, details are forgotten or embellished, and uncertainty creeps in as everything fades into the ether of time.